A very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Ananta Center, I am pleased to welcome you all to today's session on trading places. Will the new FTAs make India a global economic player? We are privileged to have with us Mr. BVR Subramaniam, CEO Niti Aayog, Professor Amita Batra, Professor of Economics, JNU, and Senior Fellow, CSEP. The conversation will be moderated by Siddhartha, Assistant Executive Editor, The Times of India. Thank you once again for joining us. Over to you, Siddhartha.
Good evening. It's wonderful to have Mr. BVR Subramaniam here with us and Professor Amita Batra. So without much ado, because I think we have about 45 minutes, 40 to 45 minutes for this discussion, and then we'll open the floor for questions. So we're in the midst of negotiating several trade deals with the UK, with EU. There's Oman. We're working with Sri Lanka to expand things. So going back a little, if Cancun was an inflection point of sorts from multilateral to bilateral, do you think that after India's decision to opt out of RCEP for the time being, would you call that an inflection point that there was a change in mindset? Once again FTAs became the buzzword. What really happened? After that, uh, that saw a series of agreements in the next few months and that took place, whether it was Australia, Mauritius, UAE, all of that.
Thank you, Siddharth. Uh, Look, the best form of trade liberalization is multilateral. And if it was delivering, then nothing like it. For whatever reason, good or bad, I think the WTO was not delivering what it should have, which is both reducing tariffs on industrial goods, uh, opening up agricultural markets, opening up services markets. It was not happening. And for a very long time, over a decade, there were no new agreements in WTO except in 22 when we added a small agreement on fisheries. I mean, probably if we had not done that agreement on fisheries, I mean, the survival of WTO would have been at stake. People would have wondered. So when you don't do it multilaterally, then the question arises: what do you do? Do you live in a freeze, time warp, without any change and just continue as it is? Or you try to take some other measures to actually open up? First of all, there has to be a philosophy behind any decision making process. I mean, is openness good or bad? And I think nobody better than Amita next to me to actually expound the theoretical part. So unless you believe in something, the strategy then is going to be quite pointless. So first is you have to have some philosophical or an economic underpinning of why you're acting the way you are going to. I mean, the Indian constitution says India has to be a democracy. So, I think that's an underlying principle. Similarly, I think in trade, I think it's largely accepted that openness is good with some caveats you can put here and there. There are going to be sectors, etc. Two, the 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 unprecedented, you know, growth that has happened in the last 30 years, in which millions of people have been lifted out of poverty, can be attributed primarily to trade and openness. I mean, and people always think of China, but it's not just China. Across the world and including India, it's the openness and the boom in trade which has enabled countries to escape poverty, or at least large numbers of their people to escape poverty. The question is, these are challenges India also faces. A, escaping poverty, and B, raising incomes and living standards. I think in known history, closed economies raising people out of poverty, there are not too many, if I'm not correct. So once you subscribe to that philosophy, then you have to strategize. Okay, how do we do it? As I said, the first is a multilateral approach. If it doesn't work, then the question is, okay, what is the next best? The second best is either bilateral or regional kind of a stuff. Here also, India actually was becoming a large country, probably the only large country, which was not plugged into enough bilateral or regional arrangements at all. You see all our neighbors, you see even China for that matter, or smaller neighbors like Vietnam, you go across the world, South America, they all had a lot of regional arrangements and a lot of bilateral arrangements through which actually they opened up markets for each other. We were unfortunate. I mean, we live in a region where we don't have the best of neighbors. So SARC and its free trade zone never, SAFTA never really took off. So you had to look at other options. For whatever reasons, good or bad, RCEP, we walked out of it. But once you do that, then are you going to stay where you are in splendid isolation? I keep saying, and be, I also use another word, be intoxicated with our domestic market, which is what we were and are even now. And I'm telling you, that's the biggest red light in future. Once you decide on a strategy, okay, we are going to use trade to be one of our engines of growth, then you start saying, okay, who are the countries you're going to have free trade agreements with? And you, like a domino, you also decide, have some quick wins. There was a certain atmosphere that our past FTAs have not helped us much. Whatever the reason, the way they were negotiated, the outcomes may not have been as satisfying. We may agree or disagree on that, but there was a feeling of perception. So you actually then calculate, strategize. So what happened was, we actually did that in commerce, looked at the entire world and said, okay, who are you going to negotiate with? What are the things that can actually help you, at least in the short run? Primarily, it'll help you in the long run with everybody, but at least work out a sequence. And that's how we identified some countries where you can do it quick and fast, gain some domestic support, break open some doors. So if you look at that, there was a method to the sequence which is there. I can tell that later. But so that is what led to a change of thinking. And one last thing, if you just open India's trade statistics, say from around 2011 onwards, till then you will find our trade growing at some X% rate, which would typically be a S curve or whatever. But around 2011, if you see the graph, it almost becomes like an ECG or something, just going around up and down, up and down. For the next 10 years, you just fluctuated between, say, something around 290 to 310 billion dollars per annum in terms of exports. You were basically stuck. How can you be a growing economy without one engine of the economy, which is trade, firing on all its engines? So I think that immediately led to this rethink, that if you don't do that, you are not going to achieve your overall growth ambitions and also poverty ambitions.
Uh, Professor Batra, India has few trade agreements given the kind of size it has. There are always concerns of Indian industry losing out and some of the FTAs not delivering on the promise uh, that people talked about. Have things really worked for India in terms of the FTAs? Have we managed to get the gains, utilization of the f- uh, of the uh, of the facilities that are on offer? So, what is the overall macro assessment that you would make?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. And thank you also for this very detailed exposition of how India got into FTAs and the necessity of it. Uh, but I think a little bit of the first question I'd like to also take up, which is in terms of RCEP as the inflection point. And as was mentioned, the emaciation or the complete weakness as far as WTO is concerned. Now, here, just one more additional point, which has kind of changed the nature of trade, and that which has necessitated basically the emergence of FTAs as the major means of conducting trade today. The nature of trade that has changed because the nature of production has changed. And that has been facilitated by the earlier ICT revolution, of course, which made it so easy for people to travel, for goods to travel, for information to travel. And that is what allowed for or made possible for production to be segmented basically into different stages of production so that lower end production stages could be located elsewhere in the world. Companies and countries looking for cheaper locations, that's how China became the factory of the world. That's kind of simplifying everything in one sentence. But you have earlier this process being led by Japan, the entire flying geese process of Japan leading FDI, investing in many of these Southeast Asian economies, many of the East Asian economies that came up that way. and later you have other countries joining in. So it's basically this segmentation of production, you see, that allowed for, or that made it necessary that inputs or intermediate goods start to cross borders multiple times. It's only a final assembly that's happening in one country that says made in China, but nothing actually may be made in China. Everything is coming from elsewhere and being put together, only assembled in China. And that everything coming from elsewhere changes the nature of trade, which is what the WTO rules and provisions did not provide for. And as we moved ahead, you see, with many changes that happened, WTO was not able to keep pace with these changes in production and the nature of trade. And you gradually have, in the last decade or so, a complete emaciation of the WTO, the multilateral trade order, starting with the Doha Development Agenda, when you have a difference as far as the opinions or the objectives of the developing and the developed world are concerned. And this is one agenda, or this was the only round actually, as was stated, you see, where we haven't reached any agreement of substance, except that I would add the trade facilitation agreement, Uh, and that particular, the Doha Development Agenda that in a way was meant for developing countries did not perform because the developed countries did not agree to accepting the objective of development around which the agenda was set out. And so you have the emergence of the bilateral and preferential trading agreements. That's really the point of inflection, I would say, globally. For India, we've had trade agreements earlier. We started in the early 2000s with the framework agreements with Thailand, which actually has not fructified into a full agreement even till date. This was, I think, we signed it in 2003, the framework agreement. So did we with ASEAN. So we did get onto the bandwagon of trade agreements as they picked up momentum in the rest of the world. But I think the rest of the world moved ahead with a clear understanding of what these trade agreements were meant to facilitate. Whereas we moved around, I think, with a little bit or a limited understanding as far as trade agreements facilitating this kind of production was concerned. We never entered into this kind of production. Till date, we talk about making everything within the boundaries as far as India is concerned. That is, we kind of take it to be complete supply chains that should be done within behind protectionist tariff walls, you see. So you've had the rest of the world do it, rest of the world get on with bilateral and preferential trade agreements. We did too, but ours were limited in scope, you see. And you have with RCEP really a change in the character of the trade agreements in terms of scope, wider, many more countries entering into it, and the depth of provisions. Whether it was competition policy, intellectual property, investment liberalization, services liberalization, our refusal to do that or our objections to those were more to do with coming from a place of protectionism within or a protectionist inward looking thinking within vis-a-vis trade as a whole, rather than in terms of looking at trade agreements as facilitative of participating in this kind of production, which I think has actually even followed the RCEP. I mean, although I think I would like to credit our diplomats in terms of the speed with which we've done some of these agreements, UAE, the early harvest with Australia, but the substance in terms of depth, you see, and the substance in terms of leading us to be a part of these global value chains and production segmentation process, that hasn't happened even now. So we need to have different agreements, EU, UK, which we've been negotiating, I think, for a very long time with suspensions, in the sense of periods of suspended negotiations, taking up again. Now again, we are doing that, but I think it's been a very prolonged process of negotiation. And I personally would like to see that we undertake or we bring about an early conclusion of trade agreements with the EU, UK, the comprehensive with Australia, and even the review as far as ASEAN is concerned.
You touched upon it in your first response, sir, on the method. If you could help us understand the bigger picture, on what the strategy is. Are we really ready to move on, with taking commitments and say going beyond trips, on competition, on gender, because what we've seen in the initial few agreements that have been signed is a statement of intent. And is our industry ready for that? And how long do you think it would take them to be prepared for this kind of a transition?
Thank. So I'll mix some of the earlier answers with the answer to your question. Firstly, I think I'll build on what Professor Batra has said. Number one, 70% or 80% of world trade takes place inside GVCs, global value chains. That means a product crosses, or what finally goes into a product is probably sourced from 30, 40 locations, and each part of it crosses boundaries innumerable times. If you take a Dell computer, I mean, and if you draw the supply chain map of that, it will look like a beehive or a web of a spider. You actually can't figure out what is coming from where. That is reality. So is with an Apple iPhone or anything like that. So, in a way, supply chains were facilitated by technology, as she said, and also, I would say to some extent, also this has been facilitated by the informal Chinese networks, because it largely grew in East Asia and Southeast Asia. These are not places where people went through written agreements necessarily. It's a lot of trust. So, in a way, you have to have a mindset that this is all part of one manufacturing game. The WTO and its rule system and a lot of the FTAs earlier ones India negotiated had a particular business model: raw material, produce, finished product. That's not the way modern products are made. If you look at the most traded groups of products, and today morning I was sitting on that for 2 hours because we're trying to work on auto components. Okay, biggest is electronics, followed by auto components, it's followed by chemicals. These are massively traded stuff across the world. India's share is somewhere around between 2 to 3% in all these. And that's after supposedly good performance in the last few years. So we are actually negligible given the size and heft of India should be having in manufacturing. It is not there. So our strategy for entering that, while the long-term goal is actually to go really big, is uh, there were 2 points. We went into trade agreements, including WTO, with a developing country mindset of how do you get the best for yourself and keep as many barriers in place through a negotiating process. Okay, I think that's been the mindset of our negotiators. You don't do trade agreements with that mindset. I mean, there is something called good faith. I am going to benefit by cutting down barriers. I would like you also to cut down your barriers. That's a positive mindset. So I think once you approach agreements with that mindset, nothing happens. In a way, India has traditionally been treated as somebody who's been blocking things in the WTO, largely because of this. I'm saying this very bluntly. Now, requiring that change in that mindset actually requires a couple of things. You have to change negotiators, number one. Old negotiators can't, because their bread and butter for 30 years has been taking one particular line of action. The second is there's a huge domestic constituency which has been fed that that is the right approach. So they are the ones who actually get worried. We are going to hit, etc. All trade agreements are going to lead to some winners and some losers. You don't have to wait for trade agreements. All changes lead to some winners and losers. Auto rickshaws come, rickshaws have a problem. You see, and you have a problem on say vehicles in Delhi. You bring in some law, somebody's gonna get hit. This is reality of life. So I think that's the same thing with trade. It's no different from the impact of technology. Having said that, how do you break through the maze of resistance points that are there? And that's where the strategy comes in. You pick up and sign agreements with countries which are least disruptive to your setup. You sign one with UAE. It's not a manufacturing country. Okay, the only things they make are oil, chemicals, dates, now metals, and that's it. So not an issue. You just have to handle a few small groups, aluminium, and that's it, and no more than that. You sign something with Australia. Australia is a third world country with first world living standards. Sorry. But that's it. I mean, what is Australia's largest trade? It's agriculture, it's mines, mineral stuff. I mean, that is it. I mean, so it's the easiest country to do an FTA with. I mean, there's nothing which Australia makes which they can sell to you other than, wheat, pulses, dairy, coal, iron ore. I mean, so you can actually strike a deal very fast. And that's why that was also struck very, very fast. But then comes the more serious stuff. These are not very, there is no need also for a deep FTA here. But the point is, a lot of the new FTAs, what we call FTA 2.0 or the second generation FTA, are very deep FTAs. The deep FTAs are not only about removing barriers, but about integrating markets and production systems, which means you go into far and far behind the border into internal issues. With Australia and Dubai, UAE, these were not big issues. So where are these issues? These are issues with UK, with EU, with Canada, or if at all you do one with the US. These are issues there. So again, there has to be a certain way of handling it. So you begin with a country like UK. So the hope was you will do UK first. You do UK first. It's a country which, again, in terms of size, geography, and the product profile, isn't that much of a big threat to India in that sense. I mean, what are the big ticket stuff with the UK people want to sell to India? Whiskey, okay. It's Scotch is GI. They can't actually ramp up Scotch production. If it's in 10 villages, you can't go to an 11th village. And we are already the world's largest drinkers of Scotch. And that's 5% of India's consumption of whiskey. So there's no way we can drink 10%. And there'll be no Scotch left for the rest of the world. They will make some high value cars. There will be a few chemical products or whatever. So it's an easy country. But when you sign an agreement with UK, you go far deeper into other issues. I mean, the UK FTA, which is under negotiation, has some 26 or 28 chapters. Now, it goes into areas which were not ever thought of in the past. Things like corruption, transparency, labor, gender, environment, a whole host of things which are not there. And the good thing is, 90% of those chapters are actually done and dusted 2 years ago. They're all there. Just a few finishing touches that have to be. We're still stuck on whiskey and cars. We are not stuck on these new areas. That also leads to an issue. Why is that important? It's important because that's where the world is moving. And mark my words, that's where the WTO will move. And India will be a very strong party to it when it moves. But why? There's a capacity issue. Most departments, when you go to a women and child department, they're the people who are, quote unquote, the custodians of gender in India. They won't know what kind of an agreement are we signing. We don't have any such thing, no capacity. We actually had to do a training of many departments in what trade agreements in these subjects are. The moment you do UK, then you move on to Canada, actually. Now, Canada is another easy country, but they have not Australia. They have a large industrial sector. Once you have done these two, EU becomes easy. UK, what happens is Australia actually helped the way for UK. How does it? You have actually had an agreement on wine with Australia. If wine, why not whiskey? Becomes easier. You're right. And once you do with pulses with Australia, why not pulses with Canada? And if you do cars with UK, why not cars with Europe and wine with the French? There's a domino effect. You start building them up in a sequence. We can even now tell you, if we close UK, within three months you can close many others, because then your intent that India has actually closed deep FTAs would get set. But where should it lead to? And I don't know if it's your next question or preempting you. Once you have done this, and EU is particularly important because it's as big as the US as far as we are concerned in terms of trade, market size, demand. We should actually be joining the CPTPP. Is it CPTPP? Yeah, we should put in our application, because the other interesting, we have bilateral FTAs with most countries in the CPTPP. We have one with Japan, we have with Korea, we have with Australia, we have with ASEAN, and China is not there. And we are signing up with UK, which has just entered the CPTPP. So once you enter that, you are entering a much larger trading profile. You're keeping your problem areas out of it. I think that should be the future way to go. As far as handling domestic things are concerned, going step by step incrementally helps. You break down resistance. Secondly, I think the messages have to go. We are a large growing market, and our manufacturers want to protect this market for themselves. It's a sure sign way to disaster. If you think you can protect India by building higher and higher and higher walls, uh, you remember the Chinese emperor, 1600 or so, he sent ships around the world, 1,000 ships, and then they came back saying there's nothing for the rest of the world to tell us, or we can learn from them, and they burnt the ships after that, and that was the end of China. India has to engage with the world, because what happens is we will be then cut off from development from rest of the world. And engagement can never be one way. It has to be two way. So you have to open your markets, but use the opening of our markets to open other countries' markets. But again, remember, trade is good faith, and you need to do it knowing that it's a two-way thing which benefits both. A couple of months ago, last month, I guess, Airtel bought in British Telecom. Okay. Now, if people start thinking, oh, our family silver or Indian, UK telecom companies being brought, then what? So our own companies have ambitions. Push the people. I mean, there will be people who will disappear. There is no doubt about it. Take the top 10 Indian industrial groups in 1970 and the top 10 now. Barring two or maybe two, I don't even think of a third one. There are none there. That is the future. So the top 10 Indian industrial companies, firms, or groups you see today, mark my words, 20 years down the road, 50% of them are not going to be there anymore at that level. They will exist. There will be always some family wealth. So that is what trade does. And I don't think we should get hostage to these interests.
Professor Batra, one of the issues that will confront negotiators would be agriculture. Australia is making demands for opening up certain segments of agriculture, dairy. Uh, how feasible is it to do it? Again, a test case maybe. And number one. And number two, how do you handle it politically?
Well, I'm certainly not the best person to tell you how to handle it politically. And I wish we could handle trade issues politically better. We would be in a different place today. Just one or two things again on the earlier bit. When we say, I mean, it's kind of fascinating to listen to the way you put it out. But I would just kind of say, as a counter, if Vietnam can do it in a quicker, shorter time, they entered the WTO only in 2007, and in the next decade, they had done their major FTAs with the EU. They had before that another agreement with the US. They've done it with UK. So with all developed economies, they've already done it, and they've also included the deeper provisions. They've in fact, like I think we should have, locked in their domestic reforms with the provisions that they have included in these FTAs. So I mean, I'm not so sure if we can make this a sequential process of doing one and then following it with the other, each time hoping that the industry or the country will at large become used to the impact as far as an FTA is concerned in terms of the winners and losers. Because as you said, there are always in every process winners or losers. It's for the state to be able to take care of the losers, and I would say to learn from other countries. Japan has done it, Korea has done it. They've all done it by reskilling people and relocating the losers from the losing industry or factories to the gainers. So that kind of a shift or that kind of a change will always happen. It's for the state to be able to retrain, reskill, have reskilling boards for that matter, to be able to absorb those who lose in the market. And why not should we be doing this in the sense of emulating at successful examples that are right in the neighborhood in terms of Vietnam, which has been able to increase its share in global manufacturing exports, from almost not being there, to as much as we have, and we've been stuck at that for more than a decade. That is less than 2%. So there is something that has to be changed, that has to change as far as our thinking, our perception of the trade agreements and these agreements as instruments of bringing gains in terms of manufacturing specialization, export competitiveness, and even as far as employment is concerned. Whether it be China, whether it be Vietnam, they've all got employment increase happening at the lower end in terms of low-skilled, unskilled people, which is where we abound as far as our employment challenge today is concerned. So why shouldn't we be looking at FTAs also in that context of how it's being done by the other countries? One. The second thing that I would want to say is, that when we talk about these deeper provisions, which is going way beyond what is happening at the border to behind the border policies in terms of intellectual property, domestic regulatory frameworks, etc. That's one part of it. But we are unable to accomplish even the initial bit, which is what all other countries are able to do in terms of being able to negotiate appropriately the number of tariff lines. I mean, we just liberalized 70% of our tariff lines, as against Australia offering 100% right away, which is again starting from our domestic protectionist, inward looking sentiment, policies, and the mindset that we have both politically as far as industry is concerned, in order to have a protected domestic market. This is where we think we can make, as far as the industry is concerned, make the maximum profits. They don't need to look outside for as long as they are getting protection. But it is competition that pushes you to choose the best. It is competition that makes you compete with the best. You look for the best inputs, most efficient inputs. You increase productivity, you increase growth through that process. In the process, employment, poverty reduction, all of that follows from it. So I think the entire thinking, as far as we are concerned, in terms of A, looking at trade, B, looking at trade agreements as instruments facilitating our integration with what has become the dominant way of production and trade across the world, that is an absolutely fundamental shift that we require in everybody's mindset, I would say. That's one. Two, as far as agriculture is concerned, I have to say, I mean, in the sense, as it's one of the most protected and most difficult to negotiate, not just as far as India is concerned, but around the world. So in that, I mean, I would make a concession for livelihood concerns, as far as India's major proportion of the population that depends on agriculture and resides in rural areas, depends on rural occupations, etc. So there we have to play a very, very careful kind of a role, you see, or we have to take up a very, very careful way of negotiating our way around agricultural commodities. Dairy, yes, I mean, starting from RCEP, we've always objected to it, you see, whether it be in terms of UK, EU, we've been objecting to dairy liberalization. There, I think, I mean, sir is the best, to advise or to be able to say whether this is right or wrong. I would say, why not follow the example that we've done as far as Australia is concerned in terms of wine, where you have a price differential and you've allowed for the higher category wines to be given a liberalization, a liberal tariff regime, in comparison with the category that actually competes with the domestically produced wines. Why not do the same with dairy products? Cheese, I mean, we don't have the kind of variety that the rest of the world has. We are nowhere near competing with that. And they are not competing with what we are producing at the income levels that we are selling largely to. So I think there again, some kind of opening up and change as far as our perceptions or in terms of our gradations within that sector is concerned would be an appropriate way to go about it.
Just a small point. I agree. The domino effect of these agreements should be much faster. But I didn't give a time dimension. I meant each should be done in months. So you get agreement out every 3 months. So it's not to be stretched over a decade or two. Number one. So I think that's very important. The second thing is, in agri, dairy, these kind of things. For a country like India, with all its domestic issues and challenges, we are a growing economy. All kinds of fancy foodstuffs are still available in some stores in some parts of the country. So quotas would be a nice way of actually giving. After all, you are seeking access. Most countries would like a little something to actually, you have to understand, a trade agreement has to be sold on both sides. So the other person will also have to show something. So I think quotas are a good thing. One more thing about FTAs, slightly different from EU and all. In our neighborhood, we are the largest economy. So I think it makes not only economic sense to have very deep FTAs, and even if it is to be one-sided, so be it. Uh, it helps us a lot diplomatically also. Be it Sri Lanka, be it China, Bangladesh, be it Nepal, we should be large-hearted, go very, very deep. And the last thing about Vietnam is there's a lot to learn from Vietnam, but there's one caveat. These are countries with narrow economic basis. They do not produce the entire spectrum of goods. When actually you see India, forget trade, even domestic policy, take cotton. From cotton in the fields to the yarn, to the fabric, to the garments. India sits on the entire value chain. So, you try to help one part of the value chain, you immediately start troubling somebody else on the same value chain. So, if you want to tamp down cotton prices, farmers are unhappy. If you allow those prices to go up, the yarn fellows are unhappy. You allow that to go up, the fabric fellows. So, this is a very interesting country where you actually sit on the entire value chain. So, for us, negotiating trade agreements becomes that much slightly more trickier. But all the same, I mean, a country like Vietnam is a very good example. They have a FTA with the United States. Unthinkable for us because they're no longer thinking on those lines, the counterparts. They've used trade as a fantastic strategy to grow themselves industrially. And to be very fair, our neighbors, Bangladesh, although they are a one or a two trick pony, just fabric, garments and nothing else, but they've used that effectively to raise incomes and create jobs.
Uh, Mr. Subramaniam, how much of a stumbling block are these? Is our position on bilateral investment treaties? One hears that UK has an issue. European Union would want changes. Even the Gulf countries would want changes. So, how much is it a stumbling block, and what should be the strategy there?
Okay. We have a model BIT or BIPA. Let me be very clear. That one is such an outlier. I mean, I don't think there is much interest in that. And I think the government realizes it and they're looking at modifying it. Number one. Number two, the BITs are big ticket requests or demands when you talk to UK, when you talk to EU, etc. It's natural. You see, we are still looking at agriculture and manufacturing in India. Those countries have become services economies, large exporters of capital, etc. So for them, it's a very, very important thing. Now let me talk actual reality. BITs are irrelevant today in an Indian context, and I'll tell you why. Unlike goods, money is fungible, it can move through multiple channels. We have three BITs locked into for eternity with Singapore, with Japan, and with Korea. So if a British company doesn't have a BIT with India, they will route the money through their Singapore branch and they will get covered by that BIT. This is reality. Even the so-called Great Vodafone case, the company is British and we are India, the fight was not in the British jurisdiction, it was in the Dutch jurisdiction because it came through the Dutch subsidiary of Vodafone. So the point I'm saying is, we already have three BITs, and my standard argument for anybody who wants to take a hard position on BITs in India about not moving from our model BIPA, I said, look, you're in a boat. You already have. Suppose it's a bad thing. Those BITs which are there with these three countries, those holes are already there in your boat. Water is pouring in from there. A couple of holes more won't make any difference because it is already there. So I think that we should have a very pragmatic attitude. Now the question is, will it lead to a phenomenal jump in capital flows just because there is a BIT? Honest answer, no. Giving a very honest answer. The reality is, I've asked the Standard Chartered, they said, you have all the clients, you're a global bank. Will any of your clients' investment decisions change because we have or do not have a BIT? No, that's the answer. Unanimous. There is no exception to that. Then what is it then this BIT brings in? It brings two things. One, at a very mundane level, a sense of satisfaction to the negotiator on the other side that I have struck a BIT. And mind you, it's very important. That fellow is giving away his whatever he has to you. What is there for him to sell back home? So a BIT is something. So it's actually a negotiator's victory, not the real victory. That's why I said they actually won't have a real impact. Number one. Number two, it's important politically for them to sell. Suppose you're talking to UK and you have a BIT with UK, they can go and tell the city of London, your stuff is safe, secure. We have a BIT which is, rock, cast in stone. Your investment is protected. So I think it's more perceptional rather than real. But the last point is, a fact is, and it's happened long ago, not real, be it our flip-flop on, retrospective taxation. We have had enough flip-flops in India around the world. And let me tell you, particularly in the world of finance, it's a very small club, be it Mumbai, be it London, be it New York. They all talk to each other in the same club or the same pub in the evening. They talk. And when they talk, is the buzz positive or is it the buzz doubtful? So it's important to get into that and get the right buzz in. Signing BITs gives a sense of comfort that, oh, I don't think anybody intends to go to court. Nobody wants to take a state to court, unless it's really egregious. It just gives that satisfaction. You will have a lot of fence sitters who will actually maybe swayed by the word spreads, it creates a good atmosphere. That is one. Last but not the least, think of it. We have got ambitions to be a $30 trillion economy. Somebody, I mean, your in a newspaper, it's a good article. Do the math of what are the credit requirements of India, what are the capital requirements of India. They are huge, huge. If you want to actually sustain 8-9% growth rates, can the banking system provide that kind of capital? Can our domestic industry have that kind of a capital? Do our savings rates justify that kind of capital? And again, it's math. If you don't have that, you will not have the output. So you will need to suck in capital from outside. And to the extent that the buzz then becomes positive, I think BITs do help.
Thank you. So we have 15 minutes to go. I'd like to open the, yeah.
One line, and maybe that would be a question, because it's so good to be enlightened here, by the real world, what should I say, real politique of the whole stuff. No, when we say that BITs are a must, yes, I mean, because they give you that assurance and protection and so on. But most of the countries today have moved away from BITs to incorporating the provisions in investment chapters in the PTAs, which we again shy, we kind of don't want to do that. With Australia, for example, we haven't done that. So this kind of a transition from the old kind of thinking, traditional thinking that we've had, that we should have BITs, and of course we've had this retrospective which kind of wavers the confidence on the other side. We haven't done an investment chapter so far with anyone. The FTA thing is very different, I think. So in that sense, why is it that our policymakers take so long to make this transition to a modern, the done way everywhere else in the world as far as these basics are concerned? Investment capital, as you say, we need it. BITs are outmoded. Our dispute settlement mechanism in that is even more outmoded. So when, again, I'll give you the example of Vietnam, which has changed its dispute settlement mechanism as far as its investment chapters are concerned. What is it that takes us so long to do that?
An investment chapter in an investment treaty is not fundamentally very different from a BIT, except that it's parked in a trade or an economic agreement. A BIT has a life of its own. It has an expiry date built into it. Trade agreements are in perpetuity. I think that answers why there is this diffidence of putting a BIT in a trade agreement, because there are views. Because then this perpetuity thing, why do you think the Singapore thing is so strong? It is stuck into an agreement which is there for perpetuity, and whatever we may try, they will never try to actually change that agreement. That side won't agree. So either we actually close that agreement and walk out of it, or we live with whatever is there. If you think the Singaporeans are going to change, so I think that's where the diffidence comes from. But I think it's a larger mindset issue. It's a common two words which are used in a lot of negotiations, not just in trade, but across all spectrum. This two words called policy space. Okay. This policy space is something I've seen being thrown around so freely in multiple contexts, be it environment, be it Montreal Protocol, be it our own trade. I mean, agreements are about giving up a bit of sovereignty. You are taking into a global system where you're foregoing your freedom and your policy space deliberately because of some gains from whatever you're subscribing to. So I think this policy space is a bit of a cloud which covers up some other intentions rather than the true intentions. I don't think it's either weak negotiation or a negotiator doesn't want to reveal his position or doesn't know what his position or her position is. But I think a lot of this BIT stuff, etc., is also about policy space, and you will hear that most advanced countries do have agreements of all types. that doesn't restrict their policy space, freedom of action, and security issues. Security trumps everything everywhere. So I think that is not even an issue at all. So I don't think we should get worried. I think there is deep churn thinking going on in government. Hopefully, let's keep our fingers crossed. There may be some changes.
Right. So, anyone from the audience, kindly introduce yourselves and please ask. Yeah.
No. Uh, Thank you. It was actually very enlightening session. So my question is to sir. I mean, I heard you at the Ananta India-US Forum this January mentioning capital account convertibility, which still probably doesn't have as much receptivity in the government. But when we move ahead with, say, the FTAs and the entire trade enablement, how do you see that progressing forward? And my second question would be again on the domestic constituents and preparing the country at large for these FTAs and its implications. So a lot of the groundwork has also been to be done at the legislative level, maybe in a bipartisan spirit. A lot of that, I would say, noise and din we see is typically raised, in the spirit of opposition. But can we hope to see maybe a more bipartisan approach in our legislature so that the country can move forward?
Who's it addressed to?
Oh, sorry, I'm Rakesh. I'm with Carlyle, private equity firm. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, when you say this din and noise as far as trade agreements are concerned and how does the mindset change, I think as far as the other countries are concerned, they've made a conscious effort of making both the chambers as well as the politicians understand the meaning and the use of FTAs. That is something that we completely are missing out on. And I don't know what kind, I mean, there may be a limited set of people who understand what the objective of an FTA is, and who would be to whom this would be acceptable in terms of the extent of sovereignty that you need to give up in each trade agreement to be able to gain something. That gain may be, spread across many constituencies as far as the country is concerned. But I think that has to be conveyed, and that has to be, there has to be a conscious effort made to make people understand that.
For that part, I'll just add on that, gains and losses are always going to be there. It's a huge communications exercise. The problem is the people who gain don't speak. It's the losers who make noise. There is pain. Okay, when you're happy, you are not going to go on the streets and shout. So I think we need to make conscious efforts to see that the noise of both sides is actually made enough so that people realize that it's not there. When you have an FTA with UK, think of what happens to our textile sector, leather sector, a lot of our labor intensive sectors. I mean, that's where Vietnam, Bangladesh, they're all actually ripping you off, So it's very, very simple. 4 to 5% is the margin in the industry. You get a 10% tariff advantage, that's, you double whatever your margins are. So I think that's the kind of noise. And then it happens only by, I like what the UK actually does when it goes for an FTA. It's a very different kind of a process. And that's because they didn't have a trade department. They created one after Brexit. They trained 900 people within a matter of 8 months in trade negotiation. Even when they negotiate, Commerce produces a team of 20. They have at least 200 people negotiating, of which 30, 40 are full time. More than that, they do actually a very big assessment of what this agreement can lead to in terms of gains plus losses. And that document is made public. It's called the public bundle. And it's made before the trade agreement is actually negotiated. So there is a large element of understanding of what this is. So what happens is changes of government are not going to really disrupt things. There's a broad understanding. Minor constituency level reasons may come in here and there at the margins, but broad. I think we need to move in that direction. I don't think we have developed those capacities, and I think commerce is reorganizing itself to develop those capacities. The ministry is giving a good lead, getting some academic depth, some technical depth, so that this kind of thing. The first thing, I don't recall exactly what I said about in the Ananta US thing, but I'm not talking about capital account convertibility tomorrow. But You are the fifth largest nation economically today, aiming to be the third. And I think today morning, so I said this day for yesterday, and today morning, some of the, I think it was Fitch or somebody said that by 2031, India will be a, S&P said that we'll be doubling our economy and we'll be third largest. We are going to be that. We are going to be a global player. I mean, you want trade to be happening in rupee. Can you be doing all that in a currency which is going to be heavily controlled? That's a simple point. All our rupee trade is actually not. It is barter trade in a currency. A rupee ruble trade is actually barter trade, yeah, which are pegging it and saying it's happening in rupees. In reality, no rupees are flowing or rubles are flowing, right? So if you are looking at a country of that, I mean, look at all the way countries who have evolved. You know, sterling was historical, US dollar came in later, but say when Japan grew, yen becomes an international currency. You know, the German mark becomes an international currency. It was not an international currency in 1930, right? It was 1960s. You know, so I think as you grow in heft, you will have to address these questions, and I think that's a very important question. Which and it's a political question, a diplomatic question, and an economic question, and these will have to be addressed and addressed boldly.
The gentleman there, and then yeah, Pramit, maybe you can go first.
I can go first? Okay. Two questions, one to Mr. Subramaniam. The first one is about the, while one of the areas we're now seeing a lot of disruption is line haul movement of cargo. Simple things like containers, ships, insurance are now becoming fragmented or difficult. A lot of the drop in export of goods that India is facing now is simply because there are no containers. If you go to Kurja Ceramics, for example, they've stopped exporting because they can't find containers at the right price. How are we addressing what something now I think is now globally going to be increasingly a problem, partly because China, as it goes into this huge export drive, is basically capturing a lot of this. It anyway controls a lot of this on its own. Second, and either of you can answer this, CPTPP I think is a great idea. What do you see as the problems we would face? It's a very high standard FTA. What would we face in having to sign up for the CPTPP?
I'll leave the CPPT to Amita, but let me mention, the problem we're facing with containers is not new. We faced it just after COVID also. There's a complete logjam. If you recall, Los Angeles port had, waiting time of weeks for, ships to even come to the port. Having said that, there are two things which are playing out. Okay, it doesn't matter. At that time, it was COVID. Currently, it's the, the Red Sea problems. So you are having a lot of issues. Two things. Maritime traffic, unlike airline traffic, doesn't need bilateral rights or anything like that. So it has actually ended up, if not as a monopoly, but as an oligopoly. There are actually only 3 shipping firms in the world which control 90% of all ships, and they control all the containers also. So I think that has become a choke point, massive. 2, they also own bulk of the containers, and production of containers is largely in China. So whenever you will see a disruption, 2 people get hit, where the volumes are low. And when you say Kurja, it's a classic case. MSMEs get hit because they never book a full container. They book part containers or just one container. They never book a shipload. That's the kind of. So the guy who's exporting cars will not have a problem. They're booking the whole ship. So I think that too, I don't have solutions because we're not currently involved in NITI, because I read something in the papers with the minister at a meeting yesterday only, is that we should be having some, the Americans have a strategic rule, 10% of whatever is their global trade, there should be adequate American bottoms on the sea to carry stuff. It's a military requirement. So, you will ensure that through law or whatever conditions have. I think we should need to have that. You can't have a situation where India has no merchant fleet at all, which could be a crisis. So I think we need to put that in, which means, but again, we get, I think there's a problem. I think government also needs to get out of it. When we think of that, we only think of a public sector route. We think Shipping Corporation of India is the only savior of India. That's where the problems start. It's not that we don't have the intent. The intent gets translated wrongly into practice. Why can't we think of private shipping lines and we supporting private shipping line? It will be slightly tricky in a democracy, parliamentary kind of a system. If you have a rule-based system by which you can actually give grants, funds, or subsidies, I think we should promote some Indian private shipping lines to do that. Secondly, on container manufacturing, there's no rocket science. I mean, this is not a rocket. It's a your porter cabin with 4 bolts which are forged. That's it. It's those 4 bolts which are most important. And there are enough Indian companies who are capable of making it. That met me. I mean, at times, they need to get started. They need a quick bulk order. So somebody like Concor should say, I am going to buy 500,000 containers from you, and I place an order. They will only end up buying 50,000, not 500,000. But that will give confidence for that chap to get in, crash the prices, and he will find a market himself wherever. So I think the state can play a major role in generating domestic production capacity in containers. So what will happen is then anybody's ability to actually fleece you gets far, far reduced. And I think that's very important. If you're talking of, again, with aspirations of $1 trillion trade and $9 trillion trade, 20 years from now, you should be having some logistics capacity also. So I think that is one. On CPTPP, I will leave it to.
Very briefly, CPTPP is more about behind the border policies than about at the border policies. We haven't as yet been able to resolve issues related to at the border policies when it comes to trade agreements, whether it be in terms of tariff liberalization, that is the commodities that we go in to liberalize, or it be in terms of rules of origin. All of these, which were problems at the time of RCEP, we withdrew, we cited these 4 reasons. They continue to be the basic issues of entry as far as CPTPP is concerned, and way beyond that. So any, issues relating to whether it be competition policy, whether it be investment liberalization, intellectual property, gender, environment, we have to be domestically prepared to be able to upgrade ourselves to that level. It's the highest level trade agreement that we have at present. So, you really have to reach that level. And if you're able to do it with UK and EU, that might be preparatory for you to enter into CPTPP. Nonetheless, I would say that I think we should make our application now. You have to be able to sit there and start negotiating. Every agreement allows you for flexibilities. I mean, look at the flexibilities that have been offered in RCEP to some of the countries. So I wish, as you say, that we had better ability to understand and negotiate. That trade negotiation training, separate cadres that are created for this, so much investment that is done in just creating a diplomatic corps that would be also understanding the trade aspects, in depth. I think that's the requirement that we must be able to push forward for.
Yeah.
It was quite an insightful discussion. My name is George Lawrence. I am a private secretary in Lok Sabha to the President of Congress Party in Kerala. So I get an opportunity to witness these discussions in from a legislative perspective. So one quick question that I want to ask is, how does climate change play a role when it comes to free trade agreements? Does India play an active role, in including points with regard to climate change in free trade agreements, or is it because for example, you mentioned about having discussions with the UK in terms of environment, to include points of environment in the FTA. So is it because that a developed nation asks us to, discuss about climate change that we start discussing about it, or do we play an active role? And just one more question. We are a big economy, and is that size play a role when it comes to the concern for, many nations while signing a free trade agreement with us?
It's a bit more complex. It's not this, it doesn't happen this way. Environmental issues are discussed in an environmental forum. Labor issues are discussed in a labor forum in ILO. Similarly, every topic has their own, what happens in trade agreements when you bring this? You're not discussing the core environmental or labor issue. What you agree is, A, you will implement the labor or environmental things which have agreed to in the other forum, and you will not make any changes to what you have agreed elsewhere to gain an unfair advantage in trade. Okay, I've said that I will do something in climate change in a COP. You are not going to violate it to gain a trade advantage. That is the limited way these things are structured. So it's not a developed country asking a developing country. As I said, they're all good faith and it applies equally to both. Okay, I have said that I will ban plastics, suppose. If you have agreed to that in a forum elsewhere, all that you say is you will not vitiate it to gain an advantage in trade. So it is all, that's the way these things are structured. So it is actually not that complex. Very often, a lot of things that are there in these behind the border agreements are there in your constitution. They are there in your legal system. So it is nothing more. Are we actually going to say that we won't do what's there in our constitution or in our legal system? It only needs that little bit of more courage to say, okay, we are going to say it with confidence that it's there in our law and we will implement the law. Saying that we want the policy space that one day, if things are unfortunate, we may want to change the law and this will constrain. I think it's a very, very circular kind of an argument.
Rani?
Uh,
Last question.
Okay. Uh, there's one trade agreement that we just signed, which we didn't discuss right now, which is the FTA, and you seem to have negotiated an investment sort of deal, not a BIT, but an investment deal inside EFTA. Is how did you do that, and is that a sign of things to come in forthcoming FTAs? And my second question is, when you're doing a deal with an FTA with EU, CBAM is going to kick in another a year and a half. Where do we put CBAM? A non-tariff barrier or something to aspire to? How do we look at that?
Okay, I'll kick off and maybe she'll answer more. Okay, first of all, I didn't negotiate the FTA agreement. It was done by Commerce Ministry much after I had left. But I know what, I was at the ring side and I'll tell you how. First of all, it's the brilliance of the Commerce Minister which got that deal through. It's remarkable. Something interesting happened when EFTA was being negotiated. I think on sometime end of last year, the Swiss announced that from 1st of January this year, they will cut all tariffs to zero. What's there to negotiate if you are at zero? So actually that's, it's very interesting, some of the most interesting development. So the two sides had to negotiate something. So actually the investment part was thrown in as a lollipop from their side, not from our side, in a way. Okay, we have some investments in India. It's not an investment treaty in that sense. So okay, investment treaty tends to be an investment protection treaty. Here it is an FDI treaty. I promise to pay the bearer so many rupees on your rupee note. I promise India that in 10 years I will invest $100 billion in India. So it's that kind of a treaty. It's very creative. It's never been done before in the past. And there are benchmarks which were laid down. And so once this idea was crystallized, at least the thought, Niti Aayog was approached to give the economic basis in terms of this. So we did some modeling, and based on past track records and this and that, we actually shot off something to Commerce. This was a midnight discussion. I mean, 24 hours sent off, which then the Swiss sold it to their side. But they have to see the feasibility, because not meeting those obligations could lead to withdrawal of some of your tariff concession. So it's an amazing treaty where nobody has signed this kind of a thing. I don't know how many times this is doable, because this is a commitment which the government can't execute. Who makes the FDI decisions? The private sector, not the government. So maybe the Swiss have an organization where they keep a close interaction with the few big companies or whatever they have. But would it be doable with, say, the US or countries with thousands of companies? I'm not sure. Okay, but it's a very, very interesting kind of a deal. On CBAM, I'm on record. Countries don't put CBAM for protectionist reasons. This is domestic stuff that is happening. Every country is entitled to domestic stuff. The CBAM is not a tariff on somebody who's outside. The firms which are there internally are going to face similar taxes. Because they are going to face those costs, they're balancing. It's not equal to customs duty. It is equal to the, we used to call it CVD in India, It's not the WTO CVD. That was the compensation for excise. Now we have GST, right? So for the compensation, you had a CVD. The CBAM is the equivalent to the CVD we used to have for our excise, because foreigners imports don't pay excise, right? The CBAM is a equalization tax so that the domestic and foreign have it. Every country, I think, is entitled to. We are also entitled to. One thing is we don't have such taxes. But let me tell you, our petrol is priced in a way that there is a very strong implicit carbon tax in our petrol. Okay. If we wish to, we could think of creative ways, etc. So I don't see CBAM as a trade barrier. It's a policy thing. And I think countries are entitled to do whatever they wish to.
I'll just add a couple of points. To the first, I agree entirely that this is hugely creative. EFTA, the deal with EFTA, very impressive, in the way we've done it. And I think we, for the first time, have combined trade with investment, because we've always kept it out of a trade agreement, But, and I would say this is a big but, this is, as was said, FDI comes from the private sector, and the state can only give a nudge to the private sector to invest. Yes, there is a kind of a penalty that we have set up, in terms of so many years later, we will have this, why didn't it happen, and then we can take back some of the concessions. If that's a 20-year long period that we give them for that nudge to take effect. And then we have a long procedural stuff that is included in terms of actually understanding why that investment did happen, So I'm not so sure if the penalty is really a penalty, in terms of the period over which it extends. So yes, it's creative in terms of bringing forth this bit, but whether it means anything in terms of actual bringing in investment will be totally different, And as far as the trade agreement is concerned, the trade between the two, EFTA and India is so small that I'm not so sure how much is going to be the gains from trade in this agreement, So yes, you've done it in name, but whether it means anything in terms of real trade gains, will be another question. Completely investment, I have my doubts, As far as CBAM is concerned, when you say this, what has happened within can be extended outside, I don't think the extraterritoriality of CBAM is not within the realm of WTO norms, So legally, there is a question mark on CBAM, even as far as the exception clause is concerned. So there is a big question mark as far as CBAM is concerned, which I think we should continue to object to at the WTO, except that the WTO doesn't have that system anymore functional. But otherwise, turning over to carbon pricing or making the transition to carbon pricing is something that we'll all need to do, because CBAM like tariffs, or taxes are going to be implemented not just by the EU, but UK, Australia, all countries are thinking about it. China is thinking about it too, So that's something that we have to evolve to in any case, So I think that should be a two-front approach that we should adopt, but at the same time upgrade ourselves also,
Thank you. And I think just on that EFTA thing, there are certain things that we have to do. We have to create that investment environment as well, which is there in the, yeah, it's and to, actually remove those tariff concessions is a long run process. So it's tough to have a penalty. Yeah, and the Norwegian funds are not included in this 100 billion commitment. Yes, yes, that's right. So it was a wonderful discussion. Thank you, Professor Batra, and thank you, Mr. Subramaniam. I personally learned a lot of things. I'm sure the audience would have also got new perspective. Thank you so much.